Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can save two lives at once. Jonas Hale had forgotten what it felt like to care about anything until he heard that desperate braying echoing through the morning mist. The reclusive mountain man found a wounded donkey trapped in the icy river, shot and abandoned by rustlers. He pulled the trembling creature to shore and brought it back to his cabin. As he nursed the donkey back to health, something unexpected happened. Jonas started talking again, sharing his fire and his meals with the stubborn little companion he named Bram. But when a young girl arrived, searching for her lost animal, the last trace of her murdered family, Jonas faced an impossible choice. The men who killed her family were still hunting, and returning Bram meant stepping back into a world he'd sworn off forever. Would saving one innocent creature be enough to restore a broken man's faith in humanity? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you: the morning air in Idaho. Territory carried the kind of cold that settled deep in a man's bones and stayed there, until summer finally decided to show its face. Jonas Hale stood on the porch of his timber cabin, a structure he'd built with his own hands 12 years prior, watching the mist rise from the valley floor like spirits departing the earth. He was 52 years old, though the lines etched into his weathered face suggested a harder journey than his years alone could account for. His beard, more silver than brown now, hung thick against his chest, and his eyes, the pale grey of winter sky, had long ago lost their expectation of surprise or joy. This was his domain, this stretch of wilderness tucked between mountain ridges where the Clearwater River bent through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. He knew every game trail, every hidden spring, every cave where a man could wait out a storm. The land had become his only companion, his only conversation, his only truth. It asked nothing of him but respect, and in return it provided everything he needed to survive. Jonas had chosen this life deliberately, though chosen might be too gentle a word. He'd fled to it the way a wounded animal seeks a dark place to either heal or die. The war had taken his youth and innocence. Disease had taken everything else. His wife Sarah, dark-haired and laughing, gone to fever in the winter of 1867. His son Thomas, barely 6 years old, following her 3 weeks later, despite Jonas's desperate prayers and his clumsy attempts at doctoring. He remembered holding that small, hot body, feeling the life drain from it, and knowing with absolute certainty that God, if such a being existed, had turned his face away from Jonas Hale forever. So Jonas had turned his face away in return. He'd sold the small farm in Missouri, packed what little he could carry, and walked west until the settlements thinned to nothing and the mountains rose up like walls between him and the rest of humanity. He'd built this cabin in a place where no neighbors would disturb him, where no church bells would mock him with their empty promises, where no children's laughter would knife through his chest with memories of what he'd lost. For 12 years he had kept this covenant with isolation. He trapped beaver and marten, selling the pelts twice a year at the trading post 30 miles north. He hunted elk and deer, smoked the meat, stored it carefully. He kept a small garden plot, potatoes, turnips, beans, and supplemented with wild onions and berries he gathered from the forest. He spoke to no one unless commerce demanded it, and even then he used as few words as possible. The trappers and traders at the post called him the Ghost because of how silently he moved through the woods and how quickly he vanished after conducting his business. His cabin reflected the man he'd become, functional, austere, without ornament or comfort beyond the essential. One room, perhaps 20 feet square, with a stone fireplace he'd mortared himself, a rope bed frame with a corn-husk mattress, a rough-hewn table and single chair, shelves for his few supplies. His rifle hung above the door, always loaded, always within reach. His traps and snares hung from pegs on the wall. A tin box beneath the floorboards held his few valuables, a small amount of coins, papers documenting his ownership of this claim, and items he couldn't bring himself to look at: a woman's locket, a child's wooden horse, a tarnished medal from the war that seemed to belong to a different man entirely. He had routines, and he clung to them the way other men clung to faith. Rise before dawn, check the trapline, hunt if meat ran low, maintain the cabin, the tools, the weapons, chop wood, haul water, prepare simple meals, sleep when darkness fell. The seasons turned, the years passed, and Jonas remained as permanent and silent as the mountains themselves. But something had shifted in recent weeks, though Jonas couldn't quite name it. The wilderness felt different somehow, as if the wind carried warnings he couldn't quite decipher. He'd noticed signs of increased activity on the lower trails. Horse tracks, cold campfires, the occasional distant sound of men's voices carried on the breeze. Outsiders, moving through the territory in numbers larger than the usual trappers or prospectors. It troubled him in a way he couldn't articulate. 2 weeks past, he'd encountered a grizzled trapper named Cutler at his favorite fishing hole. Cutler had been spooked, kept looking over his shoulder, and he'd shared troubling news. Rustlers had been working the territory, hitting small homesteads and ranch operations, driving stolen cattle and horses through the mountain passes toward the territorial line. They were organized, Cutler said, and mean. Burned out a homestead over east, killed the family. Left nothing but ashes and questions. Jonas had nodded, filed the information away, and said nothing. It wasn't his concern. He had no livestock to steal, no family to threaten. He was a ghost, remember? Ghosts didn't involve themselves in the troubles of the living, yet the information had lodged in his mind like a splinter. He found himself thinking about it at odd moments, while skinning a rabbit, while banking the fire at night. He told himself it was simple caution, the survival instinct of a man who'd learned to read danger in the land. But beneath that, something else stirred, a whisper of the man he'd once been, before grief had carved him hollow. The man who'd worn a uniform and fought for something larger than himself. The man who'd stood up when others cowered. That man was supposed to be dead, buried alongside Sarah and Thomas in the Missouri clay. But sometimes, in the space between waking and sleep, Jonas could still feel him there, waiting, watching, hoping for a reason to live again. The morning mist continued to rise, and Jonas watched it with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. A raven called from the pines, its voice harsh and knowing. The river whispered its eternal song over stones worn smooth by time. And Jonas Hale stood on his porch, a solitary figure in a vast wilderness, unaware that this ordinary morning would be the last of its kind, because even now, as he watched the mist, a sound was beginning to carry through it, faint and distant, easily mistaken for the wind or a bird's cry. But Jonas's ears, trained by years of wilderness living, caught it and held it. A sound that didn't belong to the natural symphony of the forest, the desperate braying of an animal in distress. Jonas tilted his head, listening. There it was again, weaker this time, but unmistakable. Something was suffering out there in the mist-shrouded river valley. Every instinct told him to ignore it, to go back inside, to maintain the walls he'd built around himself. Animals suffered and died in the wilderness every day. It was the way of things. Nature red in tooth and claw, caring nothing for mercy or sentiment, but his feet were already moving, carrying him down the porch steps toward the sound. His hand automatically checked for the knife at his belt, the old military habit reasserting itself. And as he walked into the mist, following the sound of an animal's pain, Jonas Hale felt the first crack appear in the armor he'd worn for 12 long years. He didn't know it yet, but he was walking toward the moment that would change everything. The moment when isolation would no longer be an option, when the choice between hiding and living would be forced upon him. The moment when a wounded creature would become the key to unlocking a heart he'd thought was closed forever. The mist swallowed him whole, and Jonas disappeared into it like the ghost he'd always claimed to be. But this time, when he emerged, he would be carrying something with him, something that would demand he remember what it meant to care, to protect, to feel. The river waited ahead, cold and indifferent, holding secrets in its current. The sound grew louder as Jonas descended toward the riverbank, his boots finding purchase on the slick stones and exposed roots that lined the steep trail. The mist clung to everything, turning the world into something dreamlike and uncertain. He moved with the practiced silence of a hunter, though he wasn't sure why stealth mattered in this moment. Perhaps it was simply who he'd become, a man who moved through the world without announcing his presence, without leaving more trace than necessary. The braying came again, more desperate now, edged with panic and pain. Jonas felt his pace quicken despite himself. He pushed through a thicket of wild roses, their thorns catching at his leather coat, and emerged onto a rocky shelf that overlooked a bend in the river. The clear water ran fast and cold here, swollen with snowmelt from the high country, its surface churning white over submerged boulders, and there, caught in the shallows where the current had pinned it against a fallen cottonwood, was a donkey. Jonas stopped, taking in the scene with a trapper's eye for detail. The animal was small, probably not more than 3 years old, its grey coat darkened by water and streaked with something else. Blood. It thrashed weakly, trying to pull itself free, but one of its legs was caught between the log and a boulder, and the cold water that rushed around it was clearly sapping what strength it had left. Its eyes rolled white with terror, and foam flecked its muzzle. Jonas could see the wound now, a dark furrow across the animal's flank, where a bullet had torn through hide and muscle. Not a killing shot, but close. Someone had shot this creature and left it to die, either through cruelty or indifference. The donkey's coat bore a brand mark Jonas didn't recognize, not one of the local ranches or homesteads he'd seen on his rare trips to the trading post. The brand was fresh, maybe a few months old, still pink beneath the wet hair. Around the animal's neck was a piece of rope, frayed and torn, as if it had been cut hastily or had broken under strain. The story was clear enough. This donkey had been tied to something, probably a line of stolen livestock being driven through the territory. When it had been shot, either by accident during some altercation or because it had become a burden, someone had cut it loose and left it to the river and the wilderness. The smart thing would be to walk away. The donkey was likely dying already from the bullet wound, and even if Jonas could pull it free, what then? He had no use for a donkey, no way to feed it through the winter, no reason to take on the burden of another living creature. The animal's fate had been sealed the moment that bullet struck it. Nature would take its course, as it always did. Jonas stood there for a long moment, watching the animal struggle. The mist swirled around him, and somewhere in the pines a jay called out its harsh warning. The river rushed on, indifferent to the small drama playing out in its shallows. Everything in Jonas's carefully constructed world told him to turn around, to walk back to his cabin, to maintain the distance he'd worked so hard to establish. But those eyes, the donkey's eyes, found his through the mist, and in them, Jonas saw something he recognized. The look of a creature that knew it was dying, that knew the world was letting it go, that had already begun to surrender to the cold and the current and the inevitable darkness. He had seen that look before, in the mirror, every morning for 12 years. Without thinking, without allowing himself time to reconsider, Jonas began picking his way down to the water's edge. The rocks were slick with moss and spray, and he had to test each step carefully. The last thing he needed was to tumble into the river himself and become another casualty of this god-forsaken morning. The water was glacial cold. He could feel its chill radiating up even before he reached it. This was snowmelt, fresh from the high peaks, cold enough to kill a man in minutes if he wasn't careful. Jonas pulled off his coat and laid it on the rocks, then waded into the shallows. The cold hit him like a fist, stealing his breath, making his muscles seize. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, the current trying to knock his legs out from under him. The water rose to his thighs, then his waist. His boots found purchase on the rocky bottom, and he used the fallen cottonwood to steady himself as he worked his way toward the trapped animal. The donkey saw him coming and panicked, thrashing harder, trying to pull away. Jonas spoke to it, his voice rusty from disuse, the first words he'd spoken aloud in weeks. "Easy now, easy. I'm not here to hurt you." The animal didn't understand the words, but something in his tone must have penetrated because it stilled slightly. Watching him with those terrified eyes, Jonas reached the donkey and laid a hand on its neck, feeling the trembling muscles beneath the wet hide. The animal was cold, dangerously cold. Much longer in this water and hypothermia would finish what the bullet had started. He ran his hand down the trapped leg, finding where it was wedged between the log and the boulder. The leg wasn't broken, which was a small mercy, but the angle was wrong, and the donkey's own struggles had only wedged it tighter. "Going to need you to trust me," Jonas muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the donkey or himself. He positioned himself between the log and the animal, braced his shoulder against the cottonwood's trunk, and pushed. His boots slipped on the rocks, and for a moment he thought he'd go under. But he found his footing, reset his stance, and pushed again. The log shifted slightly, just an inch or two, but enough. The donkey felt the change and pulled, its legs sliding free with a scrape that made Jonas wince in sympathy. But the animal was free. Now came the harder part, getting it to shore before the current swept them both downstream. Jonas grabbed the torn rope around the donkey's neck and began pulling, half leading, half dragging the animal toward the bank. The donkey resisted at first, too frightened and cold to think clearly. But Jonas kept talking to it, kept his voice steady and calm, and gradually the animal began to follow. The current was stronger than Jonas had anticipated. It pulled at his legs, trying to tumble him, and the donkey was a dead weight beside him, too exhausted to do more than stumble forward. Jonas's arms burned with effort. His legs shook from the cold and the strain, but he kept moving, kept pulling. One step, then another, then another. The bank seemed impossibly far away. His foot slipped, and for a heart-stopping moment Jonas felt himself going down. His hand shot out, catching a root that jutted from the bank, and he held on with desperate strength. The donkey bumped into him, nearly knocking him loose, but Jonas kept his grip. He pulled himself forward, pulled the donkey with him, and suddenly they were in the shallows, then on the rocks, then on solid ground. Jonas collapsed onto his hands and knees, gasping, water streaming from his clothes. The donkey stood beside him on trembling legs, its head hanging low, sides heaving. For a long moment they just stayed there, both of them too exhausted to do anything but breathe and be grateful they were still breathing. Finally, Jonas pushed himself to his feet. He was shaking violently from the cold, his fingers numb, his teeth chattering. He needed to get back to the cabin, get warm, get dry. But the donkey couldn't make that climb in its current state. Jonas looked at the animal, really looked at it, and felt something twist in his chest. The bullet wound still seeped blood, mixing with the river water that dripped from its coat. The animal's eyes were half closed, and its breathing was labored. If Jonas left it here, it would die. Probably within the hour, from blood loss or shock or simple exhaustion. All his effort would have been for nothing. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to put a bullet in its head and end its suffering quickly. He had his pistol. It would take one shot, and then he could walk away with a clear conscience, knowing he'd at least prevented further pain. But Jonas found he couldn't do it. Something about the way the donkey looked at him, with trust instead of fear now, stopped him cold. This animal had been betrayed by humans, shot, abandoned, left to die alone in the cold water. Jonas would not add another betrayal to that list. Not today. Come on then, he said, gathering up his coat with numb fingers. He fashioned a crude lead from the torn rope and began the slow climb back up the bank toward his cabin. The donkey followed, stumbling on the rough trail, but following. And with each step, Jonas felt the weight of what he'd just done, settling onto his shoulders. He had broken his own rule. He had let something in. He had allowed himself to care whether another creature lived or died. As they emerged from the mist into the clearer air above the river, Jonas glanced back at the animal limping behind him. Its coat was matted and bloody, its eyes dull with pain and exhaustion. But it was alive. They were both alive. And for reasons Jonas didn't want to examine too closely, that seemed to matter more than it should. The cabin came into view through the trees, and Jonas quickened his pace. He had work to do, a wound to clean and bind, an animal to warm and feed, a choice to live with. The life he'd built on solitude and silence was cracking open, whether he wanted it to or not. And the strangest part was that some small, long-buried part of him felt relieved. The trading post trip had unsettled something in Jonas that wouldn't settle back down. He tried to lose himself in the familiar routines, checking traps, hunting, maintaining the cabin, but his mind kept returning to the stories he'd heard. The burned homestead, the murdered family, the orphaned girl. It was during his next supply run, 3 weeks later, that everything changed. Jonas had brought Bram along, the donkey now fully recovered and proving himself useful for carrying supplies. They arrived at the trading post in late afternoon, the sun slanting through the pines and casting long shadows across the dusty clearing, where trappers and traders conducted their business. As Jonas was loading cornmeal and coffee onto Bram's pack, a man in black approached. He was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and a bearing that suggested education and purpose. A missionary, Jonas recognized from the simple wooden cross hanging at his neck. "Excuse me, friend," the man said, his voice cultured but warm. "That's a fine donkey you have there. May I ask where you came by him?" Jonas felt his shoulders tense. "Pulled him from the river some months back. He was shot, left for dead. Nursed him back to health." The missionary's eyes widened with something like recognition and hope. "Shot, you say? And where was this?" "Clearwater River, about 10 miles upstream from the falls." Jonas studied the man's face, seeing the excitement there, and felt a sinking sensation in his gut. "Why do you ask?" "My name is Reverend Thomas Matthews," the man said, extending his hand. Jonas shook it automatically. "I run a small missionary settlement in Clearwater Valley. We've been caring for a young girl, Emma Calloway her name is. Her family was killed by rustlers about 4 months ago. Their homestead burned to the ground. Emma survived by hiding in the root cellar." Jonas said nothing, but his hand moved unconsciously to rest on Bram's neck. Matthews continued, his words coming faster now. "Emma keeps asking about her donkey. The animal carried her mother's belongings, you see. Quilts, photographs, letters. Everything they couldn't carry themselves when they fled Missouri. When the rustlers came, Emma's father tried to fight them off, and in the chaos the donkey broke free. Emma believes that if she could find the donkey, she'd have some connection to her parents again. Something to hold on to." The weight of those words settled onto Jonas's shoulders like a physical burden. He looked at Bram, at this stubborn, opinionated creature who'd become his companion and friend, and felt something inside him tear in 2 directions. "The brand on his flank," Matthews said quietly. "Does it look like an interlocking C and M?" Jonas had seen the brand 100 times while treating Bram's wounds, while grooming him, while simply standing beside him. He nodded slowly. "Calloway and Martha," Matthews said. "Emma's parents. They registered that brand when they settled here 2 years ago." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Emma wrote this. She's been giving them to everyone who passes through, hoping someone might have seen her Gus." Jonas took the paper with numb fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting was childish, unsteady, but achingly earnest. "My name is Emma Calloway. I'm 9 years old. My mama and papa were killed by bad men who burned our house. My donkey Gus ran away, and I miss him very much. He's gray with a white nose and has our brand on his side. Gus was carrying all of Mama's special things. If you find him, please bring him to the missionary settlement in Clearwater Valley. He is the last piece of my family I have left." Jonas stared at the words until they blurred. He thought about the months he'd spent with Bram, the conversations, the companionship, the slow thawing of the ice around his heart. The donkey had saved him in ways he was only beginning to understand. And now he was being asked to give that up. But he thought about Thomas, his own son, barely 6 years old when fever took him. He thought about what it would have meant to have anything at all, that had belonged to his boy. A toy, a piece of clothing, anything to hold and remember and cherish. And this little girl had lost everything, her entire family destroyed in one brutal night. And she was clinging to the hope that somewhere out there, her donkey still lived. "Where is she?" Jonas heard himself ask. "The girl, Emma, at the settlement," Matthews said. About a day's ride from here. She's with us now, safe and cared for, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's not healing, Mr. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Hale. Jonas Hale. Mr. Hale. Emma goes through the motions of living, but there's no light in her eyes. She's lost everything, and I think she believes that if she could just find Gus, it would prove that not everything is gone, that some small piece of her old life still exists in this world." Jonas looked at Bram, and the donkey looked back at him with those calm, knowing eyes. They'd been through something together, the two of them. They'd saved each other in ways that went beyond the physical rescue from the river. Jonas had learned to care again, to feel again, to hope again. And all of it was because of this stubborn little creature who'd wandered into his life on a cold, misty morning. "I need to think on this," Jonas said finally. Matthews nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course. But, Mr. Hale, there's something else you should know. The rustlers who killed Emma's family, they're still active in the territory, and there are rumors that they know Emma survived. She's a witness to what they did, and—" He hesitated. "We worry that they might come for her, to finish what they started." Jonas felt his old military instincts kick in, sharp and clear. A child in danger from men who killed without conscience. You have protection. Men who can defend the settlement. We're missionaries, Mr. Hale. We have faith, but we don't have fighters. Matthews met his eyes directly. "I won't pretend I'm not hoping you might consider staying. The way you move, the way you carry yourself, you were a soldier, weren't you?" "Long time ago," Jonas said shortly. "Some things don't leave a man," Matthews observed. "The skills, the instincts. Emma needs her donkey, Mr. Hale, but she also needs protection. And I think perhaps you need something too. A reason to step back into the world. A purpose beyond survival." Jonas wanted to refuse, wanted to climb onto Bram and ride back to his cabin and pretend this conversation had never happened. But he thought about Emma's letter, about her desperate hope that her donkey still lived. He thought about his own son and what he would have wanted someone to do for Thomas if their situations had been reversed. "I'll bring him," Jonas said quietly. "Tomorrow. I'll bring Bram, Gus, to the settlement." Matthew's face lit with relief and gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Hale. Emma will be so—" "But," Jonas interrupted, "I need to know more about these rustlers. Everything you know. Numbers, descriptions, their patterns. If I'm bringing this animal to the settlement, I'm painting a target there. And I won't do that unless I know what we're facing." Matthews nodded seriously. "Come to my camp tonight. I'll tell you everything I know." That evening, Jonas sat across a fire from Reverend Matthews and learned the full story. Emma's father, Sheriff Calloway, had been tracking the Harker gang for months. They were organized, brutal, and led by a man named Silas Harker, who'd ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war. 5 men total, all hardened killers, running a sophisticated operation, stealing livestock and selling them across the territorial line. Calloway had been close to gathering enough evidence to arrest them all when they'd struck. The attack had been precise and vicious, no witnesses left alive, no evidence remaining. Except Emma, who they'd somehow missed in the root cellar, and the donkey that had escaped into the wilderness. "They've been asking about her," Matthews said quietly. "In the towns, at the trading posts. They know she survived, and they know she could identify them. Right now, they don't know where she is, but it's only a matter of time." Jonas stared into the fire, his jaw tight. He'd spent 12 years avoiding exactly this kind of trouble, this kind of danger. He'd built his life around the principle of staying uninvolved, staying apart. And now he was about to walk straight into a situation that could get him killed. All because a little girl needed her donkey, and his conscience wouldn't let him walk away. "Tomorrow, then," he said. "I'll follow you to the settlement." That night, back at his camp with Bram, Jonas couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll, looking at the stars, and thought about the path his life had taken. From soldier to husband and father, to grief-stricken wanderer, to hermit, and now, what? Protector? Defender of the innocent? He looked over at Bram, who dozed peacefully nearby. "What do you think, friend? Ready to go home?" The donkey's ear twitched, but he didn't wake. Jonas smiled despite the weight on his heart. Tomorrow he would give up his companion. But maybe, in doing so, he'd find something even more important, a reason to be fully human again. Jonas woke before dawn, the old military habit of rising early, too deeply ingrained to break even after all these years. He built up the fire and made coffee, then set about preparing for the journey. It wasn't far, a day's ride, Matthews had said, but Jonas prepared as if for a much longer expedition. His instincts, honed by 4 years of war and 12 years of wilderness survival, told him this was more than a simple errand of mercy. He cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, running the oiled cloth down the barrel, checking the action, ensuring everything moved smoothly. The Henry repeater had served him well through his years in the mountains, keeping him fed and safe. He loaded it fully and packed extra ammunition in his saddlebags. His pistol received the same careful attention as did the hunting knife he'd carried since his army days. The knife deserved particular focus. Jonas sat at his table and sharpened it on his whetstone, the familiar scrape of steel on stone filling the cabin with its rhythmic song. He'd owned this knife for nearly 20 years, and it bore the marks of that time, small nicks in the blade, wear on the handle, a patina that spoke of use and care. During the war, it had saved his life more than once. In the mountains, it had skinned game, cut rope, carved utensils and tools. Now he sharpened it for a different purpose, not hunting animals, but perhaps defending the innocent. The thought sat heavy in his mind. While he worked, Jonas talked to Bram, who stood nearby watching with his usual attentive expression. "You're going home today," Jonas said quietly, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. "Back to the girl who lost you. Emma, her name is. She's 9 years old and she's lost everything except the memory of you." Bram's ears swiveled forward, listening. "I'm going to miss you, friend. These past months, you've changed something in me. Made me remember what it feels like to care about something beyond my own survival." Jonas paused in his sharpening, looking at the donkey. "I pulled you from that river thinking I was saving your life. Didn't realize you were saving mine too." He returned to his work, the knife's edge growing keener with each stroke. "The thing is, Bram, I know I have to let you go. You belong with Emma, not with an old hermit in the mountains. She needs you more than I do. She's lost her family, and you're the last connection she has to them." His voice roughened slightly. "I know something about that kind of loss. Know how it can hollow you out, leave you empty." Jonas stood and tested the knife's balance, the weight familiar in his hand. He slid it into the sheath on his belt, then began packing supplies, dried meat, cornmeal, coffee, hardtack. Enough for several days, maybe a week. He wasn't sure how long he'd stay at the settlement, if he'd stay at all. But preparation had kept him alive this long, and he wouldn't abandon it now. As he worked, his mind kept circling back to what Matthews had told him. Emma's father had been the county sheriff, tracking dangerous men, gathering evidence to bring them to justice. And those men had killed him for it, killed his wife too, burned everything to ashes. Now they were looking for the daughter, the witness, the one person who could identify them and testify to their crimes. Jonas had spent 12 years avoiding exactly this kind of trouble. He'd built his entire life around the principle of non-involvement, of staying apart from the conflicts and violence of the human world. But Emma Calloway hadn't chosen to be involved. She was a child, innocent, caught in circumstances beyond her control. And Jonas found he wouldn't turn his back on that. He remembered his own son, Thomas, at that age. The boy had been curious and brave and entirely trusting of the world's basic goodness. The thought of Thomas facing the kind of evil that had destroyed Emma's family made Jonas's chest tighten with old grief and new anger. No child should have to know that kind of fear, that kind of loss. "I won't let them hurt her," Jonas said to Bram, his voice low and hard. "Those men who killed her family, if they come for her, they'll have to go through me first." It was a declaration, a commitment, and saying it aloud made it real. Jonas Hale, who'd spent more than a decade hiding from human connection, was about to walk straight into danger to protect a child he'd never met. The irony wasn't lost on him. He finished packing and loaded everything onto Bram, distributing the weight carefully. The donkey stood patiently through it all, as if he understood the significance of what was happening. When everything was ready, Jonas stood back and looked at his cabin, his sanctuary, his refuge, his prison. He didn't know when he'd return, or if he would at all. That decision would depend on what happened at the settlement, on how serious the threat was, on whether Emma needed more than just her donkey returned. "Time to go," Jonas said, more to himself than to Bram. They set out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jonas led Bram down the familiar trails, through forests where he knew every tree and stream, across meadows where he'd tracked elk and watched eagles. This was his country, his home, and leaving it, even temporarily, felt like abandoning a part of himself. But as they descended toward the settlement, Jonas felt something else stirring beneath the reluctance. A sense of purpose, sharper and clearer than anything he'd felt since before the war. He was moving toward something that mattered, toward a choice that would define who he was and who he wanted to be. Not a ghost hiding in the mountains, but a man standing up for what was right. Bram walked steadily beside him, occasionally looking up as if to check on his companion. And Jonas found himself grateful for the company, even knowing that in a few hours he'd have to let it go. They'd saved each other, the man and the donkey. Now it was time for both of them to save someone else. The settlement came into view as the sun reached its zenith. A cluster of buildings in a cleared valley, a main structure that probably served as chapel and meeting house, a few smaller cabins, a barn, fields recently planted for the summer growing season. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Jonas could see figures moving about their daily tasks. It looked peaceful, pastoral, entirely unprepared for the kind of threat that might be heading its way. Jonas's hand moved unconsciously to touch the knife at his belt, then the rifle slung across his back. He'd been a soldier once, trained to assess threats and formulate defenses. Those skills had lain dormant for years, but they came flooding back now with crystalline clarity. He could see the settlement's vulnerabilities at a glance. Too much open ground, limited sight lines, buildings positioned for farming efficiency rather than defense. If the Harker gang decided to attack, they'd have every advantage. Unless someone changed the equation, unless someone prepared the settlement for what might be coming. Reverend Matthews emerged from the main building as Jonas and Bram approached, his face lighting with relief and hope. Behind him, in the doorway, Jonas caught a glimpse of a small figure, a girl with dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. Emma Calloway, the child who'd lost everything. The reason Jonas was here, about to step back into the world he'd abandoned. About to risk everything he'd built in his mountain sanctuary, Jonas looked at Bram one last time, memorizing the lines of his stubborn, beloved companion. Then he squared his shoulders and walked forward to meet his destiny. Emma Calloway stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, her eyes locked on Bram. Then something broke inside her. Jonas could see it happen, see the careful control she'd been maintaining shatter like glass, and she ran. Not with the abandon of a child running toward something wanted, but with the desperation of someone reaching for the last solid thing in a dissolving world. Gus! The name came out half sob, half prayer. Gus, Gus, Gus! The donkey's ears pricked forward, and he made a sound Jonas had never heard from him before. A soft, welcoming bray that held recognition and relief. Emma reached Bram and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his grey coat, and began to cry. Not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that shook her small frame, the kind of crying that came from a well of grief too deep for words. Jonas stood back, his throat tight, watching. Bram stood perfectly still, patient and gentle, as if he understood the weight of what he was bearing. The donkey turned his head and nuzzled Emma's hair, and she held on tighter, as if Gus were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. "Oh, my brave girl," Matthew said softly, approaching with care. "You found him. Your Gus came home." Emma looked up at the Reverend, then at Jonas, her face streaked with tears. "You found him? You brought him back?" Jonas knelt down so he was at her eye level, uncomfortable with the gratitude shining through her grief. "I pulled him from the river some months back. He was hurt, but he's healed now, strong as ever. Thank you, Emma whispered. Thank you, thank you, thank you. She turned back to Bram, running her hands over his coat, checking him as if to make sure he was real. Mama's quilts were on him, and Papa's papers. Are they? Jonas's heart sank. He'd found no quilts, no papers, nothing but the donkey himself and the rope around his neck. Whatever Bram had been carrying had been lost to the river or taken by the rustlers. He shook his head slowly. I'm sorry. He didn't have anything with him when I found him. Emma's face fell, but she nodded, seeming to accept this. It's okay. I have Gus, that's what matters. But her voice held the hollow echo of someone trying to convince themselves of something they didn't quite believe. Matthews invited Jonas inside for a meal, and over dinner, simple fare of beans and cornbread, he learned more about Emma. She'd been living at the settlement for 3 months now, helping with chores, attending the small school Matthews ran for the handful of children in the valley. She was bright and well-mannered, but something essential had been extinguished in her. Even now, reunited with her beloved donkey, that light hadn't fully returned to her eyes. After the meal, as Emma sat outside with Bram, Matthews led Jonas to a small room that served as his study. The Reverend's face was grave as he closed the door behind them. There's something more you need to know, Matthews said. Something I didn't want to say in front of Emma. He moved to a desk, cluttered with papers, and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its cover smoke-damaged and water-stained. This belonged to Sheriff Calloway. We found it in the ruins of the homestead, partially protected by a metal box it had been stored in. Jonas took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The pages were brittle, some damaged beyond reading, but much of the text remained intact. Matthews opened it to a marked page and stepped back. Jonas read slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. The journal was a detailed record of Sheriff Calloway's investigation into the Harker gang. Names, dates, descriptions of their crimes, patterns of behavior. Calloway had been methodical, building a case with the precision of a man who understood the law and how to use it. But more than that, the journal revealed something Jonas hadn't known. Sheriff Calloway hadn't been just another frontier lawman. He'd been a U.S. Marshal before settling in Idaho Territory, a man with extensive experience hunting dangerous criminals. He'd recognized the Harker gang for what they were, not just rustlers, but the remnants of a Confederate guerrilla unit that had turned to crime after the war. They were organized, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. The journal contained witness testimony, carefully documented. Descriptions of the 5 men, Silas Harker, the leader, tall and lean with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. Cole Bradshaw, his lieutenant, a brutal man who'd killed at least 6 people in documented incidents. 3 others, Wade Tyson, Frank Mercer, and a man known only as Cherokee, whose real name Calloway had never discovered. Jonas flipped through more pages, seeing the careful accumulation of evidence. Calloway had been close, so close to having what he needed for arrests. And then the journal ended abruptly with a final entry, dated the day before the attack. They know. Saw Harker watching the house this morning. Martha is frightened. I've sent word to the territorial marshal, but help is 3 days away. If something happens to me, this journal contains everything needed to bring them to justice. For Emma's sake, for Martha's sake, someone must finish this. Jonas closed the journal, his mind working through the implications. They didn't just attack randomly, he said quietly. They came specifically to kill Calloway and destroy his evidence. Matthews nodded. And they almost succeeded. But Emma survived, and now this journal exists. It's everything needed to convict them, Jonas. Names, crimes, witnesses. But it makes Emma more than just a potential witness, Jonas finished. It makes her the daughter of the man who was about to destroy them. They'll see her as both a threat and a target for revenge. That's what I fear, Matthews admitted. And there's more. Emma doesn't know this yet, but 2 weeks ago a man came through here asking questions. Said he was looking for his brother's lost cattle, described himself as a rancher from the next county. But something about him felt wrong. The way he looked at Emma when he saw her, the way he seemed more interested in who was here than what he claimed to be looking for. Jonas felt his shoulders tense. You think it was one of them? Harker's men. I think they're looking for her. And I think it's only a matter of time before they find her. Matthews met Jonas's eyes. The territorial marshal knows about this journal now. I sent word after that man's visit. But the marshal is dealing with troubles all across the territory. He promised to send help when he could, but he couldn't say when that would be. So the settlement is on its own, Jonas said. We're missionaries. Jonas, we have faith in God's protection, but we also have eyes to see reality. If Harker's gang comes, Matthews spread his hands helplessly. We have 2 men besides myself. One is 70 years old, the other is a farmer who's never held a gun in his life. We have women, children. We're not prepared for this kind of threat. Jonas moved to the window and looked out at the settlement. Emma sat in the yard with Bram, her small hand resting on the donkey's neck, and even from this distance, Jonas could see the fragility of her peace. One little girl who'd already lost everything, sitting in a sanctuary that might not be able to protect her. He thought about walking away. He could leave right now, return to his cabin, to his isolation, to the safety of his mountains. He'd done what he came to do, returned the donkey. His obligation was fulfilled. Emma had Gus back, and whatever happened next wasn't his responsibility. But even as he thought it, Jonas knew he couldn't do it. Because he'd seen what was written in that journal, seen the evidence that could bring murderers to justice. And because when he looked at Emma, he saw Thomas. Saw his own son at that age, innocent and trusting and deserving of protection from a world that could be cruel beyond measure. The badge, Jonas said suddenly, turning back to Matthews. You said you found this journal in the ruins. Did you find Sheriff Calloway's badge? Matthews opened a drawer and pulled out a piece of bent, bloodied metal. The star was tarnished and damaged, but still recognizable. Jonas took it, feeling the weight of more than just metal in his hand. He was trying to finish what your father started, Jonas said quietly, though Emma was too far away to hear. Build a case, bring these men to justice, make the territory safe. He died before he could complete that work. He pinned the badge inside his coat over his heart, feeling it settle there like a promise. Like a purpose. I'll stay, Jonas said, at least until the marshal sends help. And I'll prepare the settlement as best I can. If Harker's gang comes looking for Emma, they'll find more than missionaries and farmers waiting for them. Matthews exhaled in relief. Thank you, Jonas, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Jonas said grimly. Harker and his men are experienced killers. 5 against 1 aren't good odds, even for someone with my training. The best we can hope for is to make attacking the settlement costly enough that they think twice. And to keep Emma alive long enough for real help to arrive. He looked out at the little girl again, at her small hand resting trustingly on her donkey's neck. She'd already lost so much. Jonas would be damned if he'd let her lose anything more. Tomorrow, I start preparing the settlement for siege, Jonas said. Show me everything, every building, every sightline, every approach. We're going to turn this place into something defensible. And if Harker comes... His hand moved to touch the badge hidden beneath his coat. If Harker comes, he's going to learn that some men don't die as easily as he thinks. And some debts always come due. Matthews nodded, hope and fear mingling in his expression. Emma will want to thank you properly. For bringing Gus home, later, Jonas said. He couldn't face her gratitude right now, couldn't accept her thanks when he'd just committed to a course of action that might end with his death. Instead, he focused on what he could control, preparation, planning, turning this peaceful settlement into a fortress that could withstand what was coming, because it was coming. Jonas knew it in his bones, in the instincts that had kept him alive through war and wilderness. Silas Harker and his gang were out there somewhere, and they were hunting. And when they found what they were looking for, Jonas Hale would be standing between them and their prey. The ghost had come down from his mountain, and he'd brought his teeth with him. Jonas sat at Matthews's desk late into the night. Sheriff Calloway's journal opened before him, studying it with the same intensity he'd once brought to military intelligence reports. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across pages filled with careful observations and documented crimes. Jonas wasn't just reading the words. He was learning his enemy. Silas Harker had ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war. That much was clear. The journal described him as intelligent, disciplined, and completely without conscience. He'd survived the war by being smarter and more ruthless than his opponents, and he'd brought those same qualities to his criminal enterprise. The gang operated like a military unit, with clear hierarchy, established protocols, and contingency plans. Calloway had documented their patterns. They preferred to strike at night, used overwhelming force to minimize resistance, and never left witnesses. The attack on the Calloway homestead fit perfectly. Swift, brutal, thorough. That they'd missed Emma hiding in the root cellar was likely the only mistake they'd made in years. Jonas pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching the settlement's layout, marking fields of fire, potential cover, approaches an attacker might use. His mind was working the way it had during the war, seeing terrain not as farmland but as a battlefield, thinking in terms of defensive positions and killing zones. The settlement's main building stood at the center, a sturdy structure of logs and stone that could serve as a final fallback position. The barn stood to the east, large enough to provide cover, but dangerously close to the tree line. 3 smaller cabins housed the settlement's families, arranged in a rough semicircle. Fields stretched to the south and west, offering clear sight lines, but also making approach from those directions relatively easy. Jonas marked the weak points, then began considering solutions. Barricades could funnel attackers into predetermined paths. The barn's loft would make an excellent sniper position. The main building's windows could be reinforced and turned into firing positions. It wouldn't be perfect, with only a handful of defenders. They'd be stretched dangerously thin, but it might be enough. When dawn broke, Jonas was still working, fueled by coffee and the grim determination that had carried him through harder situations than this. Matthews found him surrounded by papers, sketches, and notes. "You haven't slept," the Reverend observed. "I've gone longer without," Jonas replied. He stood, feeling his joints protest, and gestured at his work. "I need to see the settlement in daylight. Walk every approach, check every building. And I need to know exactly who we have. Every person old enough to hold a rifle, their experience, their temperament under pressure." Over the next 3 days, Jonas transformed the settlement. He worked with a quiet intensity that impressed even the skeptical farmers, explaining his reasoning in a way that made the necessity clear without spreading panic. He taught Matthews and a farmer named Hendricks basic rifle handling, focusing on accuracy over speed, defensive positioning over aggressive tactics. "You're not soldiers," Jonas told them as they practiced. "Your job isn't to win a gunfight. It's to make attacking this settlement costly enough that they think twice. Make them believe we're more dangerous than we actually are." He reinforced the main building's doors and shutters, creating gun ports that allowed defenders to fire while staying protected. He positioned barrels of water throughout the settlement, both for firefighting and as emergency cover. He cleared sightlines, removing vegetation that could provide concealment to attackers. Every decision was deliberate, informed by experience that none of the settlers possessed. Emma watched Jonas work, often sitting nearby with Bram, her dark eyes following his movements. On the 3rd evening, as Jonas was reinforcing the barn's loft ladder, she approached him, "Mr. Hale." Her voice was quiet but steady. Jonas looked down from the loft. "Yes, Emma." "Reverend Matthews says you're making the settlement safe, that bad men might come." She paused, gathering courage. "Is it because of me?" Jonas climbed down the ladder and knelt to her level, just as he had when they'd first met. He wouldn't lie to her. She'd earned honesty through the losses she'd already endured. "Yes," he said simply. "The men who hurt your family, they know you survived. And you're a threat to them, Emma. You can identify them, testify against them. But more than that," he pulled out Sheriff Calloway's badge from inside his coat. "Your father was close to bringing them to justice. His journal has all the evidence needed to see them hang. They'll want to prevent that." Emma stared at the badge, her hand reaching out to touch it with trembling fingers. "That's my papa's." "It is. And I'm wearing it because I'm going to finish what he started. I'm going to keep you safe, Emma. And when the territorial marshal arrives, we're going to make sure those men face justice for what they did. Will you have to fight them?" she asked. "Maybe, I hope not. But if they come, yes, I'll fight them." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a wooden whistle carved with delicate scrollwork. "My papa made this for me. He said if I was ever in trouble to blow it and he'd come running. But he can't come anymore." Her voice broke slightly, and Jonas felt his chest tighten. "I want you to have it," Emma continued, holding out the whistle. "So if you're in trouble, you can blow it and I'll know. I can't help much, but I can pray. And Papa always said prayers were powerful things." Jonas took the whistle carefully, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was excellent, the work of a man who'd taken time and care to make something beautiful for his daughter. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. "And when this is over, I'll give it back to you." "No," Emma said firmly. "You keep it, to remember." She looked up at him with eyes too old for her years. "You're like my papa, Mr. Hale. You do what's right even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. That's what brave means." Jonas had to look away, overcome by the weight of her words. He thought about Thomas again, about the son he'd lost, about the man that boy might have become. And he thought about the choice he'd made all those years ago, to run from grief, to hide from life, to let fear dictate his existence. Emma Calloway, 9 years old and orphaned, was braver than he'd been. She faced her losses and kept going, kept hoping, kept believing in goodness. "Thank you, Emma," he managed finally. "I'll do my best to honor your father's memory." She hugged him suddenly, fiercely, and Jonas found himself returning the embrace, this small human being who'd somehow become the center of his universe. When she pulled back, she was crying but smiling too. "Gus missed you," she said. "I can tell. He looks at you like you're special. The feeling is mutual," Jonas admitted. "You take good care of him, you hear? He's a stubborn creature, but that stubbornness saved his life. Don't let anyone break that spirit." Emma nodded and ran back to where Bram waited in the yard. Jonas watched her go, the whistle heavy in his hand, and felt the full weight of what he'd committed to. He'd failed to protect his own family from death. But Emma he could protect. Emma he would protect, no matter what it cost him. That night, scouts that Matthews had sent to watch the approaches returned with troubling news. Riders had been seen to the north, 5 men moving carefully through the territory, asking questions at homesteads and trading posts. The descriptions matched those in Calloway's journal. The Harker gang was close, and they were hunting. Jonas gathered everyone in the main building: Matthews, Hendricks and his wife, old Ben Cooper, who'd fought in the Mexican War, the other families, even the children old enough to understand. He stood before them, conscious of every eye upon him, and spoke with calm authority. "They're coming. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in a few days, but they're coming. When they arrive, I need everyone to know their role. Families with young children go to the cellar immediately. Matthews, Hendricks, and Ben, you're with me at the windows. Everyone else has a job." He went through the plan methodically, ensuring each person understood exactly what was expected. "What if we just left?" one of the women asked, fear clear in her voice. "Took Emma somewhere else, somewhere safe?" "There is nowhere else," Jonas said gently but firmly. "They'd track us, pick us off on the trail where we'd have no defenses at all. Here we have walls, we have preparation, we have some chance. Out there, we'd be easy targets." He looked around at their frightened faces and felt the weight of leadership settle onto his shoulders. "I know you're scared. That's natural, and it's smart. Fear keeps you alert. But I also need you to trust me. I've done this before, defended positions against superior forces, protected people from those who meant them harm. And I'm very good at it." His words seemed to steady them somewhat. Old Ben Cooper spoke up, his voice gravelly but strong. "Fought at Chapultepec in 47. Still remember how to point a rifle in the right direction." "Count me in, son." Jonas nodded his thanks. The old soldier's support would help hold the others steady. That night, Jonas made his final preparations. He positioned ammunition at each defensive position, loaded all the rifles, established signals for communication between positions. He walked the perimeter one last time, checking every detail, looking for weaknesses he might have missed. In the main building, he found Matthews praying in the small chapel area. Jonas stood in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. Matthews looked up, sensing his presence. "Will it be enough, Jonas? All our preparations?" "Honestly, I don't know," Jonas said. 5 experienced killers against 4 defenders, one of whom is an old man, and 2 of whom have never been in combat. The odds aren't good, but we've done what we can. The rest," he shrugged. "The rest we'll figure out when the moment comes." "I'm praying for deliverance," Matthews said. "For all of us, but especially for Emma. She's already lost so much." "Keep praying," Jonas said. "But I'm a practical man, Reverend. God helps those who help themselves. And right now, we're helping ourselves by being as prepared as possible for what's coming." He turned to leave, then paused. "Matthews, if it goes badly, if they break through, you get Emma to the cellar and you don't come out for anything. You hear me? Nothing. Wait until it's clearly over, one way or another." Matthew's face was grave. "You're talking like you don't expect to survive this." "I'm talking like a man who's seen enough battles to know that nothing is guaranteed." "But Emma survives, Matthews. That's not negotiable. Whatever else happens, that little girl lives to see justice done for her family." Jonas walked outside into the cool night air. Above him, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to human struggles and fears. He pulled out Emma's whistle and turned it over in his hands, feeling the smooth wood, the careful carving. A father's love, made tangible. He thought about the badge pinned inside his coat, about Sheriff Calloway's last journal entry. The lawman had known danger was coming, but had stood his ground anyway, trying to protect his family and do what was right. He'd failed, not through lack of courage, but because evil had been stronger and more prepared. Jonas wouldn't make the same mistake. He was prepared. He knew his enemy, had studied their patterns, understood their tactics, and he had something they didn't, a reason to fight that went beyond survival or profit. He had Emma to protect, and a debt to pay to a dead sheriff who'd tried his best and fallen short. Tomorrow, or the day after, Silas Harker would learn that some men couldn't be intimidated, some positions couldn't be easily overrun, and some debts always came due. Jonas touched the badge over his heart, feeling its weight. "I've got your back, Sheriff," he whispered to the night. "Your daughter will be safe. I promise you that." In the distance, an owl called its hunting cry, and the wind moved through the pines with a sound like whispered warnings. Jonas stood watch through the long night, rifle in hand, eyes on the darkness, waiting for dawn and whatever it might bring. The standoff lasted another hour. Harker was too smart to rush in blindly after losing Bradshaw, and Jonas was content to wait. Time favored the defenders. The longer this dragged on, the more chance that someone might notice the trouble and alert the territorial marshal. But Harker understood this too, and Jonas knew the man would have to make a move soon. It came from an unexpected direction. While Jonas watched the tree line where the riders had been, 2 of them, Tyson and Mercer, according to Bradshaw's information, had circled wide through the darkness, using the terrain to mask their approach. Jonas caught the movement too late, saw them sprinting toward the main building with torches and oil. "Incoming!" Jonas shouted, swinging his rifle toward them. He fired, and Tyson went down hard, clutching his leg. But Mercer reached the building's wall and threw his oil-soaked torch against the logs. Flames caught immediately, licking up the dry wood, and Jonas heard screams from inside. From the tree line, Harker and Cherokee used the distraction to advance, firing as they came. Bullets splintered wood around Jonas's position, forcing him to duck. When he rose to return fire, he felt something burn across his ribs, not a direct hit, but close enough. Blood spread warm across his shirt, and Jonas gritted his teeth against the pain. He fired anyway, driving Harker back toward cover, then swung to track Cherokee, who was making for one of the smaller cabins. The shot caught Cherokee in the shoulder, spinning him around, but the man kept moving. Disappearing behind the cabin's corner, smoke was pouring from the main building now, and Jonas could hear Matthews shouting orders, organizing a bucket brigade from inside. The fire was growing fast, too fast. They'd have to evacuate soon or risk being trapped. Exactly what Harker wanted. Jonas half slid down the loft ladder, his wounded ribs screaming protest, and ran toward the main building. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet as Harker fired from cover, but Jonas kept moving, zigzagging, to present a harder target. He reached the building's door and pounded on it. "Matthews, you have to evacuate. Get everyone to the root cellar now." The door opened, and smoke billowed out. Matthews's face was blackened with soot, his eyes streaming. "The children, we can't, now," Jonas ordered. "I'll cover you, go." Matthews nodded and turned back inside. Jonas positioned himself at the corner of the building, rifle ready, watching for Harker's next move. The flames were spreading despite the bucket brigade's efforts, eating through the dry timber with horrifying speed. They had minutes at most. People began emerging from the building, families with small children, old Ben Cooper supporting a young woman, Matthews carrying a boy who'd been overcome by smoke. Jonas directed them toward the storm cellar behind the main building, a sturdy structure built into the hillside that would provide protection from both fire and bullets. "Where's Emma?" Jonas called to Matthews. "She wouldn't leave without the donkey." "She's in the barn." Jonas's blood went cold. Emma was in the barn, where he'd left Bradshaw tied up, where flames could spread if Harker decided to burn that building too. He looked toward the barn and saw Mercer, despite his burns, limping in that direction with another torch. "No!" Jonas raised his rifle and fired, but the shot went wide, his wounded ribs affecting his aim. Mercer reached the barn and threw the torch into the hay-strewn interior. Flames erupted immediately, and Jonas heard a sound that stopped his heart. Emma screaming, without thought, without planning, Jonas ran. Bullets from Harker's position kicked up dirt around him, one tugging at his coat, but he didn't slow. He hit the barn door at full speed, smashing through into smoke and heat and chaos. Flames were climbing the walls, and in the back stall he could see Emma trying to untie Bram, who was braying in terror. "Emma!" Jonas grabbed her, pulling her away from the donkey. "I have to save him," she sobbed, fighting his grip. "I can't lose him too." Jonas looked at the fire, at the flames blocking the main door, at Emma's desperate face. In that moment, he made a choice. He handed Emma his rifle. "Get to the side door, the one that faces the cellar. Run as fast as you can, and don't stop for anything. You hear me? What about you and Gus? We're right behind you, now go." Emma ran, and Jonas turned to Bram. The donkey was wild-eyed with fear, pulling against his rope. Jonas cut it with his knife and grabbed the animal's halter. "Come on, you stubborn creature! We're not dying in here tonight." He dragged Bram toward the side door, smoke choking him, flames so close he could feel his skin blistering. Behind them, part of the loft collapsed in a shower of sparks. They burst through the door into cool air, and Jonas saw Emma ahead, running toward the cellar. He gave Bram a slap on the hindquarters, sending the donkey galloping after the girl. But Jonas had emerged into Harker's sight line. He heard the shot more than felt it initially. A distant crack, followed by an impact that spun him around and dropped him to his knees. His left shoulder hit hard, arm suddenly useless. He tried to rise and couldn't. The blood loss from his ribs combined with this new wound had stolen his strength. Through dimming vision, he saw Harker approaching, rifle raised, satisfaction on his scarred face. "Thought you were smart, defending this place. But you were just one man against 5. Those are losing odds, friend." Jonas's hand moved to his belt, finding the butt of his pistol, but his fingers wouldn't grip properly. Too much blood loss, too much damage. He was going to die here, and Emma would die too because he'd failed. Just like he'd failed Sarah and Thomas. Then he heard it, a sharp, piercing sound cutting through the smoke and chaos. Emma's whistle, the one her father had carved, the one she'd given Jonas. She was blowing it from the cellar entrance, standing in plain sight, and the sound drew every eye. "Emma, get down!" Jonas tried to shout, but it came out as a whisper. Harker swung his rifle toward the girl, and Jonas found one last reserve of strength. He pulled his pistol free, raised it with his good arm, and fired. The shot caught Harker in the gun hand, just as Bradshaw's had been hit, and the rifle fell from his grip. Harker looked at Jonas with something like respect in his eyes, then at his wounded hand. then at the armed settlers emerging from cover now that the immediate threat was neutralized. Cherokee was already surrendering, hands raised, his shoulder wound, bleeding badly. Tyson and Mercer were down, finished. Bradshaw was still tied in the barn, if he'd survived the fire. "This isn't over," Harker said, clutching his bleeding hand. "Yes, it is," said a new voice. Jonas turned his head, fighting to stay conscious, and saw riders emerging from the darkness. The territorial marshal and 6 deputies, drawn by the smoke and gunfire, arriving at exactly the right moment. Or perhaps, Jonas thought, as darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, at exactly the right moment God had planned. Matthews was beside him then, pressing cloth against his wounds, calling for help. And Emma was there too, tears streaming down her face, holding his good hand. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved Gus. You saved everyone." Jonas tried to speak, to tell her that she'd saved him first, that her whistle had given him the distraction he needed, that she was brave beyond measure. But the darkness was winning now, pulling him down into quiet and peace. His last thought before unconsciousness claimed him was that he'd kept his promise. Emma was safe. Sheriff Calloway's daughter would live to see justice done. The debt was paid. And Jonas Hale, the ghost of the mountains, could finally rest. Jonas woke to sunlight filtering through clean curtains and the sound of birds singing outside. For a moment he was disoriented, not recognizing his surroundings. Then memory returned in pieces. The fire, the fight, Harker's face, Emma's whistle cutting through the chaos. He tried to sit up and gasped as pain lanced through his shoulder and ribs. "Easy now," Matthews said, appearing at his bedside. The Reverend looked tired but relieved. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. The doctor said you lost a considerable amount of blood, but the wounds are clean. You'll heal, Jonas. Slowly, but you'll heal." "Emma?" Jonas managed to croak. "Safe and sound. She's been sitting with you every day, reading to you from the Bible. She just left to help with breakfast." Matthews smiled. "That girl has taken quite a shine to you. Calls you her guardian angel, though I suspect you're not comfortable with that description," Jonas grunted, which Matthews correctly interpreted as agreement. Over the next few days, as Jonas's strength gradually returned, he learned what had happened after he'd lost consciousness. The territorial marshal had arrested Harker and the survivors of his gang, Cherokee, Mercer, and Bradshaw. Tyson had died from his wounds. The evidence in Sheriff Calloway's journal, combined with Emma's testimony and the marshal's own investigation, was more than sufficient for conviction. All 4 men would hang for murder and numerous other crimes. The settlement had survived, though the main building was heavily damaged by fire. Already the community was working together to rebuild, turning tragedy into an opportunity to construct something stronger, something that would last. Jonas found himself moved by their resilience, their determination to continue, despite everything they'd endured. Emma visited him every day, often with Bram in tow. The donkey would stand by the window, occasionally poking his head inside to check on Jonas, and the sight of the stubborn creature never failed to make Jonas smile. Emma would sit beside his bed and talk, about her day, about the settlement, about her plans for the future. "Reverend Matthews says I can stay here as long as I want," she told him one afternoon. "He and his wife, they want to—" She paused, the word difficult. "They want to adopt me. Give me a real home again." "That's good," Jonas said. "Matthews is a good man. He'll take care of you. But what about you?" Emma asked, her dark eyes serious. "Where will you go when you're healed?" It was a question Jonas had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. He looked out the window at the mountains rising in the distance, at his sanctuary that had been both refuge and prison. "Back to my cabin, I suppose. That's my home." Emma was quiet for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden whistle. "You never gave this back," she said, placing it in his hand. "I told you to keep it, to remember. And you should remember, Mr. Jonas, you should remember that you're not alone anymore. That you have people who care about you now." Jonas closed his fingers around the whistle, feeling its familiar weight. "Emma, my papa made this for me because he loved me," Emma continued. "And you kept it safe even when you were fighting, even when you were hurt. That means something. That means you care too, even if you don't want to say it." She stood and kissed his weathered cheek, quick and shy, then ran from the room before he could respond. Jonas lay there holding the whistle, feeling something tight in his chest finally begin to loosen. Emma was right. He wasn't alone anymore, wasn't the ghost he'd pretended to be. He'd come down from his mountain, and in doing so, had found pieces of himself he thought were lost forever. When Jonas was finally strong enough to travel, the marshal came to see him. The lawman was in his 50s, grey-haired and hard-eyed, but there was respect in his expression as he shook Jonas's good hand. "The territory owes you a debt, Mr. Hale. Without your intervention, Harker would have killed that girl and disappeared again. Thanks to you and to Sheriff Calloway's journal, we've broken up one of the most dangerous criminal operations in Idaho territory." The marshal held out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. "There was a reward for Harker and his gang. $500. It's yours." Jonas stared at the pouch. $500 was more money than he'd seen in years, enough to live comfortably for a long time. But he shook his head. "Give it to Emma, for her education, her future. She's the one who really earned it, surviving what she did." The marshal nodded slowly. "You're a rare breed, Hale. If you ever decide you want to wear a badge officially, the territory could use men like you." "I'll keep that in mind," Jonas said, though he had no intention of accepting. He'd done what needed doing, paid the debt he owed to a dead sheriff and his daughter. But he wasn't looking to make a career of it. He was still, fundamentally, a man who belonged to the mountains. The day came when Jonas was healed enough to leave. The settlement gathered to see him off, and Jonas found the attention uncomfortable but touching. Matthews presented him with a new coat to replace the one ruined by blood and bullet holes. Old Ben Cooper gave him a bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes. Other families pressed food and supplies on him until his pack was full. Emma stood at the front of the crowd with Bram beside her, and Jonas knelt down one last time to her level. "You're leaving," she said, not quite a question. "I am. But I'll come back to visit." "That's a promise. How often?" Jonas smiled. "How often would you like?" "Every month," Emma said firmly. "So I can tell you about school and show you how big Gus is getting and—" She stopped, blinking back tears. "So I don't forget you." "You won't forget me," Jonas said gently. "And I won't forget you. How could I forget the bravest girl I've ever met?" He pulled something from his pocket, a small carving he'd made during his convalescence, working with his good hand whenever the pain allowed. It was a donkey, rough but recognizable, carved from pine. "Keep this," he said, placing it in her hands. "To remember that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, pulling a wounded donkey from a river, giving a whistle to a stranger, can change everything." Emma threw her arms around him, and Jonas held her close, this child who'd lost so much and somehow found the strength to keep hoping, keep loving, keep believing in goodness. She'd taught him more than he'd taught her, he realized. She'd shown him that running from pain didn't end it, that isolation wasn't strength, that the only way to heal was to risk caring again. When she finally pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. "You'll really come back?" "I promise." Jonas stood and looked at Bram, who regarded him with those calm, knowing eyes. "Take care of her," Jonas told the donkey. "She needs you." Bram brayed softly as if in agreement, and Emma laughed despite her tears. Jonas shouldered his pack and began walking toward the mountains. He didn't look back, not because he wanted to forget, but because he knew he'd be returning. This wasn't goodbye. It was simply a pause, a breath between chapters. As he climbed the familiar trails toward his cabin, Jonas pulled out the whistle Emma had given him and turned it over in his hands. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the war to grief, from isolation to connection, from death back to life. He'd pulled a wounded donkey from a river on a misty morning, thinking he was simply saving an animal. Instead, he'd saved himself. The cabin came into view through the trees, and Jonas stopped to look at it. It was still his home, still his sanctuary. But it wasn't a prison anymore. He could leave it now, could come and go as he chose, could maintain connections to the world below without losing himself. He sat on the porch and carved a notch in the wood beam above the door, a marker, a reminder, a promise to return to the settlement. Then he went inside and placed Emma's whistle on the shelf beside Sarah's locket. His past and his present together. The people he'd loved and lost, and the people he'd found and chosen that evening. As the sun set over the mountains in a glory of gold and purple, Jonas sat outside his cabin with a cup of coffee and allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Contentment. Not happiness, that seemed too simple a word for what he felt, but a deep, abiding sense that he was where he belonged, doing what he was meant to do. He'd come to these mountains to die slowly, to let grief consume him in isolation. Instead, he'd learned to live again. One stubborn donkey, one brave little girl, one chance at redemption. That was all it had taken to remind him that life, despite its cruelty and pain, was still worth living. Jonas raised his cup toward the darkening sky, toward the first stars beginning to appear. "Thank you," he said quietly, to God, to fate, to Sarah and Thomas, to Sheriff Calloway, to everyone who'd led him to this moment. "Thank you for not letting me stay hidden." The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wildflowers. Somewhere in the valley below, Emma was safe with her new family and her beloved Gus. And up here in the high country, Jonas Hale, no longer a ghost, no longer hiding, watched the night settle over his mountains and felt, finally, at peace. Some wounds did heal, he'd learned. Some bridges could be rebuilt. And sometimes, the smallest act of mercy, pulling a wounded creature from cold water on a misty morning, could change 2 lives forever.